Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing the U.S. elections, and specifically, we're going to talk about the Postal Service. Now, as many of you know, there is a lot of controversy about the mail-in voting, which is expected to be unprecedented this year because of the coronavirus pandemic. Many people would probably prefer to stay home instead of going to ballot boxes physically in person. Nevertheless, there's controversy about the funding of the Postal Service. There's controversies because Donald Trump has also said that mail-in voting is susceptible to great fraud. And all of the above bringing together has created this atmosphere of mistrust, seemingly, in the Postal Service itself to begin with. Now, there have been great delays recently in post and mail reaching the respective destinations, as some people have reported. And then on top of that, there is then that funding issue, as I said as well. Even Donald Trump admitting that if the Democrats' request for extra funding for the Postal Service don't go through, that may very well then affect not just delays within Postal Service, but also possibly mail-in votes themselves, even though the postmaster himself has said that there will be no issues come November elections, that the Postal Service is very much ready to handle all these mail-in ballots at that time. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Jim Williams, who's a 7-time Emmy Award-winning journalist. He's a Washington bureau chief for LJC Media and Genesis Communications. He's joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. Joining us from Sunderland in the UK is Kevin Yuill, who is an associate professor of American history at the University of Sunderland. He's currently finishing a book on the 1924 Immigration Act. He's also published books on Nixon presidency, assisted suicide, and gun control. Kevin and Jim, thank you to both of you for joining us today here in Scope. Kevin, let me start with you. What do you make of what may occur come November this year when it comes to all these mail-in ballots? Do you think that there will be issues vis-a-vis the post offices being able to handle this huge amount of ballots?
I suspect that they'll be able to handle it. I do think that there is an issue, however, with the corruption, the possible corruption of votes that comes, because I do think, certainly from looking at British elections, that there has been evidence really that there is voter fraud going on. I don't think it actually takes place at the point of the post office. I think it takes place before then. So I don't think it's necessarily a post office issue. But I do think that all sides should be concerned about the possibility of fraud in this particular election. And I don't think I can understand the concerns that, for instance, have been put forward by the Trump campaign about this. So I do think that there is concerns there. I don't think it's the biggest issue actually in this election. I think there are a lot more interesting issues that are going to come up.
The question that I'll put to you is about the postal office, right? And it's being able to handle this entire situation. As you well know, it's become greatly politicized. You laid out the concerns in a very logical fashion about hey, there may very well be voter fraud, and that should be a concern for both sides. But as you well know, that's not how it's actually playing out on the ground. It's become very much a Democrat versus Republican issue, another divisive issue within American politics. Why do you think that is? Do you think it's the Democrats are at this point just looking for anything and everything to throw at Donald Trump?
I think there's an element of that, actually. I do think that there's, that's part of the whole issue, that they are, that is, as long as Donald Trump is there, the Democrats have something to aim at. So I think that's something that we can observe as being part of that. However, I do understand why it's an issue for instance, for the Democrats versus Republicans, because the Democrats traditionally rely on votes from people who are hard to get out voting. So when you have a higher voting count, then you tend to get a higher Democratic vote in the United States. So they're very concerned to maximize the number of votes that they're going to get. However, I don't think it's that important an issue, and I just do think that there is a possibility of voter fraud that is coming up, and I do think but the other issues I think will take over this issue, particularly with what's happened in Kenosha, Wisconsin over the last few days.
Okay, so on that topic, Black Lives Matter movement, right, Kevin, there's also been, again, as you well know, the issue of voter suppression in previous elections, especially apparently when it's come to the African-American community in respective states and cities around the United States. This issue of the mail-in votes has also been spoken of in those terms of voter suppression. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm slightly sympathetic towards that, because I do think you want to maximize in order to have democracy actually work, you want to maximize the number of people coming out to vote. And I do think there's an element of Republicans will not be as keen on getting as many people out to vote. And I do think there is a willful element to that as well. However, having said that, I think the difficulties are overplayed. I think it's a tendency, unfortunately, for Democratic voters not to come out as happily as Republican supporters. And I think that's sometimes put in racial terms. There's a historically lower percentage of the black vote that will come out during elections. So I think that's really the underlying difficulty. We can go back, however, to 2001 and say that there was an issue that was happening there that, of course, took place very dramatically with the hanging chads issue in Florida. So I do think that the Democrats are right to be concerned about it. I'm not sure they're absolutely correct to blame Republicans for the suppression of the black vote.
All right, so Jim, seemingly what I've understood is that there are, across the board, bipartisan concerns about the Postal Service, its funding, et cetera. That's been an issue for many years, seemingly. But what do you see as the solution to all this? Is it privatizing the Postal Service, as has been spoken of many times?
No, I think the post office was never meant to be privatized, okay? It was never meant to be a money-making process. It was meant to be the opportunity for people to communicate through the use of a service. And I think that Speaker Pelosi, along with Secretary Mnuchin and other members of the
Seems we may have lost our connection there with Jim again. Kevin, let me go back to you then. About the issue of privatizing the Postal Service, is that the way to go? Because as I put to Jim, there's a lot of talk about how much of a deep hole the Postal Service has created budget-wise.
No, I mean, I'm in complete agreement with Jim. I don't think the whole purpose of the post office is a private aim. I don't think it should be turned into a private company. I don't think that would resolve many of the issues that people are trying to address. And I think the post office should be left basically as it stands. It can be improved, of course, but putting it in private hands will not help anybody. And as I say, I don't think that's going to have a massive effect on whether there is fraud or whether there isn't in the upcoming election.
Okay, so let's talk about the election themselves, Kevin, because there's been talk on both sides, right? Both on the part of Donald Trump, as well as, in fact, even Biden supporters, about what the outcome of these elections will be and whether or not the respective candidates will come out immediately and accept the results as they'll stand whenever they do come out after those elections take place, right? I mean, of course, we don't know what exactly will happen and whether or not Biden and Trump will immediately accept loss or win either way. But what are your thoughts on that? Because there seems to be a lot of divisiveness just surrounding that issue as well in some quarters.
Well, I think the horrifying prospect is actually that we will have the courts settling this election, which I think is the worst of all possible outcomes for democracy. In some ways, I care less who is actually elected, although I do have preferences in it, but than the whole process of the election, because I think it's democracy that will be in real problems if it goes to the courts. And it's almost like the elements of the American Constitution are being used by technocrats and bureaucrats to sort of prevent democracy. And I think that's a real concern that is coming up in this election. I think that's my major concern. There are, of course, other interesting elements that are occurring, and I really, really hope that it isn't put into the courts. And I suspect all parties will hopefully all pull together and in the end and actually say that this election is legitimate and will accept the people's verdict on who becomes president. But as I say, the big danger is that it's thrown into the courts.
Jim, what are your thoughts about what may happen come November post these elections? Do you think that whichever candidate wins, that the other side will accept that win graciously, as has been done in previous elections, or do you think that that would create further divisiveness in an ever polarized society?
I think two things real quick. One, I don't believe, as usual, we normally know within 12 hours or so, for sure, after the final polls have closed in California, who has won. I don't believe that is going to be the case this year. And because of mail-in balloting and because of the time it's going to take for some of these states to count mail-in ballots, I think that we're looking at the possibility.
Very well. There's a final comment there with Jim and Kevin, but we do appreciate both of their times today. Kevin, they're speaking to us from Sunderland, and Jim speaking to us from Washington, D.C. Viewers, we'll be back talking about this topic once again right after this break. Stay tuned for that. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi, and continuing to discuss the controversy surrounding the U.S. Postal Service and what may very well happen come these November elections, whether or not there will be difficulties with mail-in voting within this atmosphere, of course, of a pandemic where, at this point now we have a poll that's just come out which has said Americans are less inclined than 2 weeks ago to use mail-in ballots. Is that because they also agree with the president that there may very well be fraud, or that they believe that there may very well be difficulties having their ballots counted to begin with if they do choose to use mail-in votes? Let's discuss this further with Peter McCaffery, who is an American historian. He's an author as well. He's joining us today from London. And joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. is John C. Fortier, who is the Director of Governmental Studies at the Bipartisan Policy Center. John and Peter, thank you both for your time today. John, let me start with you. Come November, would it be fair to foresee that these elections will have a lot of controversy surrounding them because of mail-in ballots, because of, fraud, et cetera?
Well, I think we are going to see some more controversy, especially if the election is relatively close. And it will surround voting by mail, I think, a significant amount, although all of our system is really under pressure from COVID, whether it is the people voting at polling places, which are losing poll workers, losing sites, and some confusion as to what voters are to do. There are some more opportunities for voters in many states and opportunities to vote by mail, but also there are changing rules. And so I think there will be a lot of confusion, and I think we will have some issues on the counting end as to how quickly we can resolve the votes. And unfortunately, I think we will have some issues as to either voters or systems keeping some of those votes from being counted in the way that people wanted to, just because of the changes and the volume and some of the issues. So I don't put it just on the post office or on fraud, but I think it's COVID causing problems all through our system and a lot of the change making it more difficult to run the election.
And that Donald Trump has spoken about, mail-in voting in not so positive terms, said that, it's susceptible to major fraud, saying that very well the Democrats may try to, quote unquote, steal the elections. I'm, of course, paraphrasing what he said. Is there some legitimate argument to be made there just on the point of fraud? And shouldn't that concern all parties involved in these elections?
Well, you're right, Waqar. Yes, it should concern us. However, though, the Federal Electoral Commission is quite adamant in stating that there is simply no basis for the conspiracy theory that voting by mail causes fraud. There's very few isolated incidents, the research has shown us, and which begs the question then why the president is taking this line. And I think we have to go beyond the conspiracy theory to look at the real reason. The real reason, I think, is that he sees voting by mail as benefiting his opponents. I think historically, a low turnout in elections has always benefited the Republican Party. And we know that Donald Trump has a much more enthusiastic base than Joe Biden supporters. Clearly, something like 2/3 of Republican voters have said they would prefer to vote in person, whereas over half of Biden supporters have suggested they want to vote by mail. So the president is resisting voting by mail in order to try and suppress the vote and to keep the turnout low. You'll recall, Waqar, that in 2016, in the election, there was something like 25% of votes were cast by mail in the presidential election. We're expecting something like 1/3 on this occasion. And as John was saying, the system will be under pressure because of the cash-saving reforms of the Postal Service and the knock-on effects of the pandemic.
John, do you agree on that point? Because that's a point that's been made a number of times, I've seen as well, by several experts about the issue of low turnout versus high turnout. Is this Donald Trump playing politics where he doesn't want as high a turnout because, again, that would benefit Democrats?
Look, I actually think some of these differences between the parties about how we vote are deeper than that. Look, I think generally Republicans are more worried about integrity issues. Democrats are more worried about obstacles in the way of voting. And even before Donald Trump, certainly Democrats have been more favorable to these forms of convenience, voting by mail early, other forms of that. So I think it's deeper than that. You can also look at the reaction to COVID, where Democrats are more concerned with wearing masks and showing up in public and voting in person. They're worried about it more, Republicans less. And so I think there's just some very deep reasons why we have these differences. You know, I think there were some differences before about who voted by mail, but I agree that we are going to see a greater split between the two parties. And one thing that worries me is, of course, that some of those votes cast by mail are going to be counted later. And if it's a greater split with many more Democrats voting by mail and many more Republicans voting in person, the election night results may look one way and they may start to move in the other direction. And, you know, I think that's something we should worry about a bit and hopefully do as best we can to count those votes and give people a clear sense of getting their votes in earlier with the hope that they can be counted clearly and earlier and less controversy.
Yeah. You know, do you think that come November, when it comes to the results, whenever they come out, that in and of itself will create controversy, especially if the results are very close? Because, you know, we've already had talk, seemingly from both parties. I mean, we recently had Hillary Clinton. There was some controversy about what she said to Biden about whether or not he should or should not concede if that is what happens come November, if that's how the situation works out regarding the votes. I mean, I wonder if we're going to just see further polarization in these elections and how that may play out on the streets.
I agree there, Waqar. That would definitely be the case. Come November, I think we're going to see, we see the president now preparing the groundwork to mount a legal challenge in the event that it looks as if he's losing the election. And he can do that in each of the 50 individual states, because, as you know, under US laws, it's the states that have control over the polling process within their own domains in federal elections. And what the states are doing, we've got 6 states now, including California, who've said they're going to be all-mail elections. So in other words, all registered voters in those 6 states will have the opportunity to cast their ballot by mail. Half the states now are saying, you know, you can have a postal vote on request. And the rest are sort of saying, well, actually, you need a valid reason to vote by post. You know, you're a pensioner, you're ill, you're absent. And of course, Donald Trump himself is a registered voter in Florida. And he voted in the Florida primary because he's a resident in Washington, D.C. I think come November, as John was saying, there will be uncertainty. There's more uncertainty. It's unlikely that the election result will be called on the day. It may well go on for several days. And if you go back to the year 2000, of course, you have to have 2 candidates in Al Gore and George W. Bush. Ultimately, they put the principle, they accept the principle, they put the country before the party, and Al Gore put the country first in conceding the election to George W. Bush back in 2000. But there isn't that good relations these days. You have hyperpolarization, and therefore we can expect a contested election if the outcome is going to be narrow.
You know, I don't want to overstate this, right, John, but do you think that there is a huge difference, as Peter there laid out, between the year 2000 and now 2020 and how polarized the U.S. is, and Biden and Trump putting the country first instead of their own parties?
Well, I do think we have more polarization, although I don't want to understate how tense 2000 was. I do agree at the end of the day, we had people accepting the result, but we went on for weeks with very, very tense back and forth over just a few hundred votes in Florida and many court challenges and many people feeling that they were wronged by one decision or the other. So I do think that that is a very difficult situation. The one thing that Florida had in 2000 that we hope doesn't happen today is just that it comes down to a state or states where it's very close. Yeah. We certainly could have a close election. We don't know. If it is close in the popular vote, it still has to be close in a state that really matters, the tipping point state. And so all those things came together in 2000. So I think we can just hope. In fact, many election administrators have the secret prayer that the election margins be wide so that these things don't come up. So I think we might be saved by that, but it certainly was a very tense time in 2000. And anytime it's razor thin, we are going to see legal challenges and very tense situation on both sides.
You know, another issue, especially in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, is that of voter suppression, right? That's been a complaint in previous elections about, you know, voter ID laws, et cetera, et cetera. The list is quite endless in that regard. Do you think that is something that will occur again this time around, or do you think we've possibly moved past that there are enough safeguards to ensure that the African-American community, for example, will not feel, at least, that it's being targeted unfairly through voter suppression, et cetera?
I think voter suppression has been a key issue in the past, and it's certainly relevant now. All Democrat leaders, including Michelle Obama and Joe Biden, have put the emphasis on go out and vote. And the mayor of Atlanta, Lance Bottoms, had said during the protest which turned violent in Atlanta, said, don't protest, don't violence, go home and register and vote. So the message has been very strong. And I think the concern is that in 2016, Hillary Clinton did not mobilize the African-American vote to the extent, of course, that Barack Obama had. And if you come back to it, it came down to very fine margins. You know, in three cities, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, and Detroit, if the turnout had been greater amongst African-Americans, then Hillary Clinton would have been in the White House. So it's about energizing the vote. And the concern for the Democrats is that certainly the benefit of Joe Biden is that he's not Donald Trump. But in reality, he did an excellent acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention. But he has to sort of energize and maintain that momentum. And the difficulty will be that we're still some time away from that yet, come November.
Very well. We'll have to leave there as a word. The clock has gotten the best of us, but we appreciate both Peter and John for their time and, of course, for contextualizing what may very well happen come November vis-a-vis mail-in voting, voter suppression. There's a lot, of course, on the table, as has been in previous elections as well. But it seems that we're right now, at least in 2020, you know, in the midst of a very polarized U.S. society, Republicans versus Democrats. And then there's, of course, a lot of issues vis-a-vis police brutality, anti-racism protests, Black Lives Matter protests, etc. So there's a lot on the table that divides Americans at this time. Will these elections unite Americans or further divide them? And unfortunately, it seems that the latter may be the case, especially about whether or not candidates will concede graciously come those results, especially if those results are close due to controversies surrounding mail-in voting, etc. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Gaza in Palestine, and specifically under three specific topics that we can talk about when it comes to Gaza right now. Now, since August 6th, Israel has been bombing the Gaza Strip. Israel says it is bombing the Gaza Strip for upwards of now 3 weeks because of incendiary balloons that are being sent over from Gaza into Israel proper. Nevertheless, of course, Hamas would say that it is defending itself, especially at a time that we've passed now the 13-year mark of that Israeli blockade of the coastal strip. There's also then talk of coronavirus and how the pandemic may play out in that coastal enclave, especially at a time, as a third topic we're going to talk about, is also because of the Seoul power plant running out of fuel. And so Gazans are at this point in time living with around 4 hours of electricity maximum a day. How will that affect how the pandemic is going to be dealt with in that coastal territory. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Akram Sattari, who is a freelance journalist and translator. He's joining us now from Khan Yunis in the Gaza Strip. Akram, as always, thank you for joining us here in Scope. Let's go step by step, right? So let's firstly talk about Israel's bombing of the Gaza Strip for now more than 3 weeks. Israel says it's because of Hamas sending over those balloons. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, to start with, I'm happy to be joining you this particular day, and I'm always happy and honored to be with you. The idea is that Israeli occupation is accusing Hamas of sending those balloons, while Hamas responds by saying that those balloons are organized and sent by youth who are angered by the siege that has been imposed in the Gaza Strip and who want to see an end to that siege. The siege that, like you rightly said, has already lasted for more than 13 years and has already caused a widespread destruction, not only in the infrastructures, but also in the psychosocial conditions of the young, of the old, of the children, and of every single person in the Gaza Strip. Politically speaking, Israel tends to accuse Hamas of every single, what they call it, balloon attack. And I think their media and their politicians are deliberately exaggerating in the impact of those balloons and are responding with this disproportionate power to every single balloon that is sent from Gaza. And because of that, they have been bombarding different places in the Gaza Strip for around 13 days. One of the strongest bombardments took place not far away from my home, and I personally had some temporary loss of hearing because of the very strong explosion that terrified entire whole blocks in Khan Yunis city. So to summarize the situation, Israeli occupation sees in those balloons as some military means to disturb them, and Hamas says that it is the right of the youth who are organizing those campaigns to express their protest, to express their rejection with those means, and also to keep opposing the occupation that has been suffocating the Gaza Strip for around 14 years now.
Akram, though, the argument from the other side would be that it is Hamas that controls the Gaza Strip, so it should then control these sorts of balloons, right, going over into Israel proper. Talking about, provocation, etc. I mean, of course, I'm paraphrasing these words, but do you think that it is a good policy for Hamas to allow for these balloons to be going over, especially at a time, as I said, with fuel shortage, coronavirus? I mean, there's a lot on the plate of Hamas to handle right now.
Well, as a matter of fact, we should take into consideration some very critical facts when we are discussing the argument and the counter argument. Israeli occupation says that those things are also incited by Hamas, and that Hamas is also training and providing tools for the people who are sending those balloons toward the Gaza enclave. And they have targeted in the past. Also, they have targeted some groups that were sending balloons towards Palestine-occupied 48. And Hamas, from its side, says that it is a legitimate way of rejecting that occupation. And if you have 2 million people locked in very limited space, and those people are deprived from almost everything, and they are not living a human life like other people all around the world. So they say, and I'm here quoting them, they say that it is fully legitimate for those youth to express their anger. And they furthermore say that if the Israeli occupation targets them, like if the Israeli occupation uses unmanned drones or just targeted killing to make sure they can neutralize some of the people who are doing this, Hamas says they will respond and they will target with missiles this time all the occupied Palestine 48 cities, and make sure that even if they will go for war, they will do that for the sake of making sure that people in Gaza live a dignified life. So if you say that Hamas has not the capacity in the meantime to do that, according to the different statements that were made by Hamas leaders in the Gaza Strip, and according to the news leaking from their Hamas meetings with the Egyptian security delegation and with also the Qatari envoy to the region. Hamas seems to be very determined in this time to respond to any violations targeting the people who are sending the balloons. And Hamas seems to be also happy and condoning those balloon attacks. And they see them as a legitimate means to protest and as a legitimate means to make sure they push the occupation to provide to remove the siege on Gaza Strip and allow Palestinians to live in dignity and peace.
Okay, so let's move on, if we can, Akram, to the fuel shortage, right? Because that's a huge factor, and that's been a factor for a very long time. It's not like fuel shortages are a new thing for Gaza. Nevertheless, this time around seems to be especially bad because, of course, the Seoul power plant, as we know, has stopped receiving fuel for quite a while now from the Israelis. How is that affecting daily life? Because if you only have 4 hours of electricity on a daily basis, I imagine that makes any work, especially at nighttime, that much more difficult, and of course also for hospitals, schools, etc.
Well, as a matter of fact, I'm talking to you and sweating now because of the very hot weather of the burning summer that we're living now, and that gives you an indication of the situation and how is it like now, given the very limited time electricity is supplied to the households in the Gaza Strip. This issue is a very chronic issue, and as a matter of fact, this issue is part of the demand that was listed by Hamas, that Hamas said that this electricity situation should improve in the Gaza Strip, and there are some mega projects that were coordinated with the Qataris and with the UN that were not realized as by far, and they wanted them to allow this electricity situation to improve in the Gaza Strip. Before, we used to have electricity supply of 8 hours a day, or 8 hours every 8 hours. But now we have them for around 3 to 4 hours a day. And that is not only affecting the households, it's also affecting the sewage pumping stations in the Gaza Strip. It is affecting the infrastructure sector in the Gaza Strip. You have clinics that are run by electricity. You have sewage pumps that are run by electricity. And Hamas, in the meantime, is planning and has already carried out some of those plans to pump the sewage water to the sea, because the sea would drift that sewage water towards Palestine-occupied 48. So the Israelis are now, to some extent, suffering from what they have done to the Gaza Strip. So electricity problem is affecting all aspects of life in Gaza in a very critical time, which is summer, which is very hot season for the people in the daytime and in the nighttime. And it's every single person in the Gaza Strip that is paying the price, and it is perceived as a means of collective punishment that is used unjustly against the Palestinians. And that is another reason for the Palestinians to rebel, and another reason for the Palestinians to protest, and another person for the Palestinians to try any means, even if they have to pay some of the price, to make sure they can change the situation they are living in the meantime.
And then, you know, Akram, there's a very worrying situation about coronavirus, right? Because this is something that a lot of people around the world had feared, that once coronavirus enters the Gaza Strip, how would it spread? How will it spread now that it has entered? How will it be dealt with, considering, you know, this 13-year-plus blockade? Tell us about that situation. Tell us about the fears on the ground of how this may spread and how it can be controlled.
So now for the 4th or 5th day, we are following the news about the outbreak of the coronavirus. And unfortunately, I can confirm some of the very shocking news about it. They have already been finding, yesterday they found 40 cases. Yesterday in the morning they discovered 40 positive cases. In the evening they discovered other 40 positive cases, and they seem to have discovered today more than 80 cases, and they are imposing a curfew on the territory. The key impact, because coronavirus has been hitting different places all over the world, there is no one single country that was spared from that pandemic. But the key issue is that Gaza is already under siege, and the health system has been struggling for such a very long time. Like when it comes to ventilator, respirators and things like that, people in Gaza and the health system doesn't have them. And I think a request was made by the ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, to allow today the entry of 40 ventilators in the Gaza Strip. And also that was one of the things that were highlighted by Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, who said, either you allow the medical equipment into the Gaza Strip, the medical equipment that are needed to deal with this coronavirus. Either you allow them by choice or you allow them by force. And he was extremely irritated by the fact that Israeli occupation was somehow procrastinating about that and not allowing the equipment into the Gaza Strip. So that is another reason for the people to be angry and for Hamas to be considering some very harsh moves if the demands were not fulfilled and if the situation and the siege has not been eased.
Very well, Akram, we'll have to leave a final word, but we do appreciate you taking your time out, of course, sitting there in the heat for us, speaking to us from Gaza. We, of course, wish everybody there well in Gaza in this situation with a lack of electricity, with continuous bombings, etc. As I said, of course, the Israelis have said that they are responding to these incendiary balloons, as they call them. But as Akram there laid out for us, it's actually the youth, at least according to Hamas, that are sending over these balloons because they're angry over this very long-standing siege, 13 years plus now. There are back and forth arguments, of course, about that, about whether this is a provocation, whether Hamas should be allowing for this to occur from its territory into Israeli territories or not. Nevertheless, the reality on the ground in Gaza is that because of these many years of blockade, the health system is already crumbling. The electricity system is crumbling. We have widespread unemployment. We now have coronavirus that has entered the territory. How will all of this play out? This seems like the perfect storm, unfortunately. And of course, in the midst of this are 2 million plus people who continue to suffer. And that is something that needs to be highlighted again and again beyond just the political rhetoric that we see from all sides as well. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.